Thank you. So AIG has received about $70 billion in TARP money, about $100 billion in loans from the Fed. Do you know where the money went?
Absolutely. And the money that, and of course happy to provide any detail that you'd like to see on this. The money in that context went to help prevent default, help stabilize a very damaged institutions that would have posed, we think, very substantial risk of systemic.
Well, maybe failure. I should ask it. Maybe I should ask it with more specificity. Was Treasury aware of who the counterparties were that were going to receive payment in full on the credit default swaps when $170 billion went to AIG?
You know, they have hundreds and thousands, maybe thousands of counterparties, but I'm sure that the supervisors involved and the people at the Fed who were at the front lines of this stuff would have access to detailed information.
So they knew who was going to get the money, the counterparties?
Well, I think they could have known. Whether they knew at the time, I'm not sure they knew it, but of course they would have access to that.
Do you know if they spoke with any of the counterparties?
In what sense?
In any sense.
About what?
About the fact that
remember, many of the counterparties are institutions that are supervised all the time. So I suspect they were talking all the time.
They were holding pieces of paper from an entity that was clearly insolvent. And the question of the government infusion of dollars there was going to make the difference between whether they got paid off in full or they ended up with nothing.
Right, but maybe so you finish. So where are you going? What would you like? What would you like to know?
I just want to know: did Treasury have conversations with any of the counterparties who ultimately profited?
I was not the Secretary of the Treasury at the time of the initial invention, but I was the President of the New York Fed. And, of course, I was central to the basic judgment we reached together to prevent default by AIG. I'm sure that was the right judgment at the time, and you're right to point out that that action did help make the system more stable, did have broad benefits to stability of the system, including the direct counterparties. But I want to say one important thing, because I think it's in the premise of your question. The reason why AIG posed systemic risk was not principally because or significantly because of the direct exposure of those institutions, those counterparties. The biggest risk of failure to the system was in the damage it would have done to both retail people who brought insurance protection, saving protections from AIG, as well as the type of risk you saw Lehman present to the system as a whole. So it was a more complicated picture.
So let me then follow up. I understand your point and the distinction you're drawing. We just finished our auto report. And Chrysler and GM, insolvent company, AIG, insolvent company. Chrysler and GM have bondholders, unsecured creditors, secured creditors, and employees, and they all took big haircuts. AIG had people holding credit default swaps, and they took no haircut at all. They ended up with money from the federal government, 100 cents on the dollar, and I'm trying to understand why those two are different from each other.
But you've spent your life thinking through these things, so you understand this better than many people. And it is sort of the tragic failure about the regime we came in with, because we did not have the legal capacity to manage the orderly unwinding of a large, complex financial institution, capacity we do have for small banks and thrifts, but did not have for an entity like AIG. And that forced us to do things that we would not ever want to do. But
are you saying that you couldn't find a way to pay less than 100 cents on the dollar there, but since you could find a way in the auto industry,
we would have done that in a second if we could have done that. But in deciding that default by AIG would have presented the risk of further systemic damage to a very fragile system, we made the judgment to prevent default. By preventing default, we helped AIG meet its financial obligations, not just to people that brought insurance protection, savings protection products, but to its broad counterparties. That is the consequence of that. And if you think through...
But not the same for the auto industry.
Well, completely different situation, you're right. But if you think through what happens when you let default happen, you can look at the wake of the trauma caused by Lehman's default to get some sense of the damage that can cause. And again, that's why we've moved so quickly to propose broad resolution authority to give us better tools for dealing with these in the future.
And I appreciate that. Let me ask one quick question, if I can slip it in before we run out of time. And that is, a year ago, we were worried about banks that were too big to fail. But in the last year, big banks have gotten bigger, while 84 small banks have been allowed to fail, and some experts are estimating that 1,000 smaller and mid-sized banks could disappear before this crisis is over. I just want to know, are we more at risk on the question of concentration than we were a year ago?
I don't think so, but it depends largely on what Congress ultimately decides to do in terms of financial reform. The only way to deal effectively with the moral hazard risk created by the consequence of this crisis and by the too big to fail problem is to make sure there are a set of reforms in place that make us better able to withstand the failure of large institutions. So we don't have to intervene to put taxpayers' money at risk to prevent them from or to provide for a more orderly resolution. And that requires resolution authority, stronger capital, better derivatives protection, a whole set of cushions and safeguards to limit the risk of contagion spreading. And that's why, again, reform is so important. And that's the only way, I think, to make the system safer for future failure.
Thank you.